Nathan Barr's music is all over TV screens this season as the composer of the Hulu period comedy The Great, the Amazon fantasy drama Carnival Row, and the Netflix limited series Hollywood. I'm Rob Licuria, senior editor at Gold Derby, and I'm here with a busy and talented composer. Nathan, let's start with The Great. It has elements of what we might traditionally expect on a period drama / comedy, but it feels more uplifting and edgier. For example, coupled with the beautiful string elements are more percussive and ambient sounds. Can you talk us through what you were going for that particular score?
Yeah, I think Tony McNamara and Marion McGowan are both really extraordinary collaborators, and there was a long history of trying to figure out what this should be as far as the music goes. They wanted to lean toward contemporary and not do something strictly period, because the sensibilities, obviously the comedy and everything of the show skews a little bit more contemporary and sort of plugs into the fact that Catherine was a very sort of forward-thinking leader. And so that's kind of what we went for. So it was they were constantly pulling me back and going, can we add a contemporary element, a synth element to this to sort of give it that sort of more modern sensibility. And that was something that I also did in the demo to get the job. I saw the pilot. I said, this is extraordinary. I'll do whatever it takes to get it. And I wrote something that was very synth based with no orchestra, just a solo violin, which is the first cue in the show. And it was based on that I got hired. So.
Right. And the synth elements really work for this show. You would think that it wouldn't, because that sounds so anachronistic, but it isn't, because of the way that the show is told in a very funny, it's very rude, it's very irreverent. And so I'm wondering, does that irreverent, uproariously comedic tone inform a lot of your other choices in terms of instrumentation?
Yeah, I think so. As you said, it's super edgy, super irreverent. And I think because the comedy, it plays so well even without music. The performances are great. The writing is great. The comedy is so funny. The music, in this case, I didn't need to be there to really fix anything, like is sometimes the case. I was really there to sort of have the music enjoy the performance of whatever the moment was with the audience. And so I think plugging into the sort of the balalaika and that vaguely Russian flavor in some of the scenes, like some of the party scenes, was one way we really plugged into that world. And then otherwise it was just sort of letting the comedy do what it was doing, because it's so funny.
It is so funny, and it's playful and cheeky, and I think a lot of that comes out in your score. But you do get to play in a more serious role in the finale when, if you haven't seen it yet, turn away. But basically, towards the end of the season, Catherine and Peter have a reckoning because they're kind of betraying each other, and it's actually a little darker than the rest of this show. Did you like the ability then to kind of turn your attention to a more serious tone as the show kind of ended?
Yeah, I think it's one of the brilliant aspects of the writing of Tony, is just throughout the season, there's this increased seriousness as to who she is going to become, despite all the comedy and the slapstick and the things going not the way they're supposed to. And so I think it's really hard, as we all know, for a show to get the tone right, to set up an ending like that still pays off and works and doesn't feel out of place. And so that was because the writing sold it, the direction sold it, the performances sold it. All I had to do was follow along with the music. And I think, again, I think if you're watching the show with attention, it's not out of nowhere. It's really it's special, and musically to be able to go dark, despite for the comedy throughout, and then particularly at the end to plug into that sort of stronger emotional core that she draws on to get to the place she's going to go. It was really fun. And I think it was all there in the pilot, like from the first cue to the last cue. There's even a journey in that pilot where she drops the knife and decides to move forward with her plans at the end of the pilot. It's such an emotional moment, and the score got to plug into that even at the very beginning.
Yeah. Now, speaking of your dramatic work, a lot of us are familiar with your previous works, such as on The Americans. Carnival Row, for me, kind of came out of nowhere. It's not necessarily that dark, but it's definitely a fairy tale in its tone and aesthetic. And I was wondering, firstly, how you became involved in that project, because there's a lot of music to be made in that particular series.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the most exciting story. I think we all come to projects as composers in any department, sometimes through people we've worked with before, and that was the case. So in the case of this, there was a picture editor named Michael Ruscio, who I'd worked with on True Blood, and another picture editor named Paul Trejo, who I'd worked with on the various projects in the past. And they both kind of simultaneously, when they were discussing composers, said, "Oh, we should get Nate to do this show or come in and meet on this." And so it was as simple as that. That's how I came to meet on that.
And then when you did become involved, what were you aiming for? Because, like, for me as a listener, the use of the string instruments really evoke this visceral and otherworldly feeling. But then you have a lot of choral and bass and percussion elements as well. There's a lot going on in this score. It's really dense. Is that what you were trying to achieve?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as anyone knows who's seen the show, like it sort of draws from real history and fantasy history, and creates this fantasy sort of steampunk world. And so one of the ways to help evoke that with the gorgeous production design and costumes and everything else was with the music. And I have a really big collection of unusual instruments, the biggest being a 1,300 pipe theater organ that was built in the 1920s for Fox Studios. And so this was the perfect opportunity for that to be featured. And so I used that quite a bit. The main title track is just that pipe organ with a solo fiddle and choir. There's a chase across the rooftops in the opening of the first episode with Philo, and that is all driven by the organ. And it's one of those rare times where I actually got the direction from the showrunner. Let's hear more of the pipe organ. So it was one of the instruments that added to that density you're talking about.
Wow, that's such a privilege to be able to kind of, go back to some of your own instruments that you have and something. I was actually wondering, what is that unusual sound? It's so distinctive. The score feels very epic in scope and scale, and I guess that's probably one of the reasons. Have you got any other examples of unusual instruments or cues that you decided to use for this very unusual looking show?
Yeah, I mean, I designed and built invented a cello that a gentleman named Fred Carlson and his partner Susie Norris made up in Santa Cruz. It's a cello with 5 main strings, 4 drone strings played with a mechanical wheel, and 10 sympathetic strings. And it looks like this sort of creature from another realm, much like those in Carnival Row. And that gets used quite a bit throughout Carnival Row. It's got a cello sound because at its heart it's a cello, but it has these sympathetic strings on it and this strange little drone, and that helped plug into that. I also used a human bone trumpet I have from Tibet, which is a couple hundred years old. It's called a kanglang, and I guess some of the monks back, that long ago, they would hollow out the bones of monks after they passed to create a relic. And so it has a very unusual, otherworldly sound that I used quite a bit as well. And then I had another pipe organ instrument called a stoutophone, which I invented with a friend, which allows me to put in random organ pipes and experiment with those. And that also got used throughout the series. So it's definitely a show that leaned heavily into some of the unusual things that I have around my studio.
That's so appropriate. Like, it's so good that you're able to mix it up a bit with a show that does the same thing. It's an otherworldly show and using otherworldly instruments. This question always baffles me because I'm not a composer, but I'm wondering if you can try to explain why string instruments evoke emotion the way they do. Like, this score employs a lot of beautiful, more higher pitched strings that really are really visceral. Why is that?
Well, I think so. This score features me playing the cello at times, and then also one of my assistants, Harry Rizzolio, who's a beautiful violin player, playing violin. And they say that cello is the closest thing to the human voice in terms of the range, the low to the high. And so I think that I would guess to venture that that the way it sort of recreates a choir, but with a different sound. It could be part of the reason it plugs into human emotion so much. A cello is such a deeply emotional instrument, and it's rich and soulful and very close to the human voice. That would be my bet on that.
Yeah, that never occurred to me. I'm glad I asked the question. Switching it up a bit then, you worked on Hollywood. It's completely different aesthetic again. So it shows some really good range that you were able to employ this season. Did the nostalgia of Hollywood come into play at all when deciding what melodies you were going to focus on for that score?
Oh, yeah. I love this period in Hollywood history. I love the films of this time. There's a composer, very famous Golden Age composer named Franz Waxman, who I'm a huge fan of. I grew up watching the films of Victor Fleming, who directed Treasure Island and Captain's Courageous, which were made in the mid-'30s. And there's a beautiful, sweeping quality to the melodies that he wrote throughout his career and during that time period, which aren't as common these days. And so it was really fun to sort of go for that sensibility. And the Ryan Murphy camp, they're very keen on making sure that a melody is memorable as best as it can be. And so it really plugged into, for me, if someone wants a memorable melody, like the best memorable melodies are hummable, whistleable. They have stepwise, they're not sort of all over the place. That's like a very sort of layman's description of it. But I think if you can go for something that is hummable or singable, then you're headed in the direction of potentially memorable. And so that's kind of what I went for. And instrumentation-wise, we knew from the beginning we wanted to not stray too far from that period in terms of what instruments you find. So it was orchestra, it was brass, it was saxophones, it was bass drums.
Yeah, and then the series is about an old film that they're mounting, putting together, and then it ends up at the Oscars.
Yeah.
What was it like to score that? Because that's a completely different aesthetic to what we would be listening to these days, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you listen to that music, like a film that just randomly comes to mind is The African Queen. There's such a melodramatic, to our ears today, sensibility. Every little wink or squint, it's just really going for it with the strings and the style, with a lot of vibrato and the slides, and it's so wonderful. But it's definitely a sensibility that's no longer around, and understandably. And so it was really about being able to plug into that in a fun way.
Yeah. Now, there's a fine line between music that is too invasive rather than being more subliminally affecting the audience's experience. And I really don't like it when people say, oh, look, the composer's job is just to kind of be in the background. I think the job can be another character in the show, depending on what you're watching. How conscious are you of that balance? And do you like the opportunity to really put your mark on a project and kind of create a character sonically or orally, I should say?
Yeah, absolutely. Meg, this movie, when I first saw that episode, I think any composer would love to do that. We would always love more time, of course, and a live ensemble, but given the crazy schedule of these things, it's not always the case. It's plugging into that was really, really one of the great fun things of the whole show, was writing that score to Meg. So
yeah. And speaking more generally of the three projects that you worked on this season primarily, can you point to any particular thematic musical elements you employed for a particular character or plot point, for example, that you are most proud of, that you keep going back to as, I really, really enjoyed that?
Yeah, I think the main title for Hollywood, there are two themes in that. The first is the Golden Tip, which is the service station, which is a front for the prostitution. That theme starts the main title, and then we go into the B section of Jack's theme. And Jack is sort of the everyman in the 40s who wanted to become a movie star and does. And so I'm proud of that theme of Jack's and the way that really managed to show up over and over again in the show. And whatever point in the journey Jack was on, it always seemed to complement it in just the right way. And then I think in Carnival Row, the main theme, which is Philo's theme, which you also hear in the main title, that's another one that seems to work really well and lend itself to his journey as a character.
Yeah. Well, is there a particular science to creating the most effective main title theme? Because most of us TV fans are obsessed with this stuff. Like, the main title theme for the Americans is so memorable. The main title theme for Carnival Row is so gorgeous. Like, are you distilling the whole aesthetic of what you've done in 1 minute, or are you doing something different? Like, how does that work?
I mean, I think oftentimes you write the main title after maybe one episode. I don't know what the show is going to be in its entirety when I write the main title. So it's like that impossible ask where the producers come to you at the beginning, and the case of the Americans, they said, okay, you have 24 seconds and we want to really know what the show is in 24 seconds. Well, on paper, that's ridiculous. But it was one of the first themes I wrote. Again, I wrote a demo for that, and it became Elizabeth's theme. And then in the case of Carnival Row, same. I think someone once described it as like it's got to be strong enough and unique enough that when someone's out grabbing their popcorn from the kitchen, they know it's time to rush back in because the show's starting. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think that is the perfect way to put it, because it happens all the time. It was nice that you were able to do some Russian inflections on the great, given that we are used to your little Russian inflections on the Americans.
Americans, right? Yeah, exactly. A couple hundred years earlier.
Yeah. I'm like, it's nice energy there. My final question is one that I always ask composers. It's one of my favorite things to know from composers, and it's this: as a film and TV nerd, I have my favorite song, right, that I listen to all the time, in the car, on my iPod, at home. What about you? Because this is what you do for a living, and you know it so well. When you think about other people's scores, what do you hold most dear in terms of what you thought was the best work?
I mean, generally speaking, I like composers that are have a unique personality and are trying to say something different. Obviously, there's a whole horde of composers out there who do something really well, and it's a part of the larger tradition of that sound. It's got that classic film music sound, and I think that's great. But I really like the outliers, the ones who are really approaching it from a different angle, either because they're not traditionally film score people, but that they, like, I hear it and right away there's like a particular sound that is totally different or unique, or an approach to melody or harmony that are really special. And that's kind of what I'm always listening for in the work. But generally speaking, because I do this for a living, I don't listen to a lot of film music beyond when I'm experiencing it in the film or TV the show that I'm experiencing.
And is that because you want to try to keep your mind kind of free of any other influence or inspiration, and you just want to be inspired by the actual work that you're working on?
I think it's because, like, my dad's a poet, and he used to say, like, the best way to be a good poet is to go out and live life and have experiences and come back and then distill them. And I think it's the same thing. If I'm writing film music and listening to film music, where are the ideas going to come from that are fresh and interesting and that bring something new to the tradition of it? And so I think that's really what it is. I want to get away from it when I'm not doing it, just to really find something new that I can pull in and try and introduce.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect way to put it. Well, look, everybody go to goldderby.com, make your predictions and click subscribe. And meanwhile, thank you, Nathan, so much for your time today. Fascinating insights about your wonderful work this season. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. This is great.